Continuing with topic 2 of paper 3, we move on to paragraph 3.7 on page 2.9, responsible officers, representatives and executive officers, and this is all part of licensing a corporation. Who is a responsible officer? Well, it must be a licensed representative, and as it says there, who actively participates in or supervises a regulated activity, is nominated by the licensed corporation and is approved by the SFC. So do you have to have a responsible officer? Well, you actually have to have 2 responsible officers per regulated activity, and at least one must be based in Hong Kong. It also says there in the middle of the page, every executive director of a licensed corporation is required to obtain the approval of the SFC as a responsible officer. Now, this applies to executive directors who work full-time, who actively participate in or are responsible for directing the business of regulated activity. Now, for registered institutions, remember, those are banks, authorised financial institutions who are registered with the SFC to carry out a regulated activity. We're told the banking ordinance requires at least 2 executive officers to be responsible for supervising regulated activities. And again, one has to be available at all times. What that means is that responsible officers are the term used for licensed corporations, and executive officers is the equivalent term used for registered institutions. Now, representatives, that's the individuals who operate for a regulated activity. They must be licensed. And if a licensed representative ceases to be employed by a licensed corporation, then the corporation must notify the SFC within 7 business days of cessation. In other words, if you're a licensed rep working for a licensed corporation and you resign and leave, then that licensed corporation must inform the SFC within 7 business days of you leaving. Relevant individuals and executive officers, this is just the terminology. The equivalent of the licensed rep with a registered institution is relevant individual. I wouldn't worry about that at all. And as I've said, the equivalent of responsible officers in registered institutions are executive officers. And the umbrella term, executive officer, right at the bottom of page 2.9, covers responsible officer of a licensed corporation, executive officer of a registered institution, and director of an associated entity. We'll come to that in a moment, who's directly responsible for supervising the receiving or holding of client assets. That's just sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I wouldn't worry about paragraph 373, but it is in the material. Top of page 210, displaying of certificates. All corporate license certificates must be prominently displayed in a corporation's office. So you will often see the license certificates in the reception of licensed corporations or hanging on the wall. And we're told if there's more than one office, certified copies of certificate should be displayed at other offices. Again, I would say that's peripheral material. Now, associated entities might come up. The formal definition of an associated entity is a company which is in a controlling entity relationship with the intermediary and receives or holds client assets of the intermediary in Hong Kong. Now, if we cut through the sort of formal terminology, an associated entity usually is usually held 100% by the licensed corporation, and an associated entity will hold client assets. So it could be something along the lines of Investment Bank Nominee Holdings Limited. It's a company which holds client assets, but it doesn't do anything. As such, it does not need to be licensed. So that's a major point. But associated entities are covered by things like the client security rules, the client money rules, the keeping of record rules. So we should be aware of the concept. And as we're told there, second bullet point, associated entity cannot conduct any other business unless authorised in writing by the SFC. That's to make sure they don't stray into the world of a regulated activity because they're not licensed. We then come to the concept of substantial shareholder. Who are substantial shareholders? They are shareholders of licensed corporations with a significant holding. What is that significant holding? Well, we're told the indented sub-bullet points have an interest of more than 10% the nominal value of the issued share capital, or directly or indirectly have more than 10% the voting power of the company at general meeting, or you're able to exercise 35% or more of the voting power of another company, call that the holding company, at a general meeting, which in turn has more than 10% the voting power of the company of the licensed corporation. Now, if you satisfy any of those points, you are a substantial shareholder. So what's the big deal with substantial shareholders? They must be approved by the SFC. So if you are going for your license to the SFC to become a licensed corporation, the SFC want to know who are the substantial shareholders of the licensed corporation, and they want to approve them. Last 3 bullet points, bottom of the page, substantial shareholder must keep the SFC informed of his or her contact details, notify the SFC of any changes within 14 days. A person who becomes a substantial shareholder without obtaining permission is breaking the law. You're committing an offence. And then if you're in the situation where you become a substantial shareholder, but you don't realize that maybe there's a rights issue and other people don't take up their rights, and suddenly you increase your percentage shareholding and you're not aware of it, you have a defence. But as soon as you discover that you are a substantial shareholder, you must inform the SFC. It says there, as soon as reasonable, practical, within 3 business days is the guidance. So be aware of the concept of responsible officer, be aware of the concept of substantial shareholder, and also associated entity. I would add that in. Okay, we're now on to the licensing of representatives. These are the individuals working for a licensed corporation where they carry out regulated activities. So what are the general requirements under 4.1? So individuals that are conducting the regulated activities within licensed corporation, they need to be individually licensed. You can act for more than one licensed corporation within the same group of companies. Then we have the idea of temporary license. The SFC can grant temporary licenses to representatives of a licensed corporation that have come from overseas. So you're based overseas, maybe you're an analyst overseas, you come into Hong Kong and present to clients of the licensed corporation. So let's say you're work in the New York office, you come to the Hong Kong office and you do some work in Hong Kong and then return to New York. You must hold a temporary license, and a temporary license cannot be held for more than 3 months at a time. Now we have the concept of provisional license, and that's before you get a full license. So if you arrive in Hong Kong, you're going to work full time, you're going to carry out a regulated activity, the SFC will provide you with a provisional license. There is a time frame within which you must then be granted a full license, and usually the obstacle to being granted a full license is passing the exams. Once you pass the exams, the full license usually follows. And the last bullet point under 4.1 tells us if a licensed rep ceases to be employed by a licensed corporation, corporation must notify the SFC within 7 business days. Now, we covered that earlier in this topic, but it then goes on to say, if the license is not transferred to another licensed corporation within 180 days, then the license is deemed to have been revoked. What does that mean? It means if you resign from a licensed corporation, you hold a license, then you must be re-employed with a licensed corporation in Hong Kong, and you transfer the license, but it must be done within 180 days, 6 months. And if you go beyond that, well, if you're going to be re-employed, in a licensed corporation, you must reapply for your license. Now, we had fit and proper guidelines for corporations. Now we have fit and proper guidelines for individuals. And it's the same categories as we saw before. Financial status or solvency must be satisfied. Competence and capability must be 18 years or older. Well, 18 years of age is the only age criteria in all the exams, so it's rarely examined. Character and integrity. To hold the license, you must be of good character, you've not breached any of the codes or guidelines, etc. Right at the bottom, we're told individuals who are granted a license must continue to meet the requirements on an ongoing basis. It's not good enough just to satisfy them during the application period. Top of page 2.12, continuous professional training. 2 points to highlight here. You need 5 hours of continuous professional training per year per competence group of regulated activities. So a competence group, as part of the way down the page indicates, that would be type 2 and type 5. So if you were licensed for type 2, dealing in futures, and type 5, advising in futures, that combined you would need 5 CPT hours per year. And what are the activities that qualify as CPT? They're listed there: attending courses, workshops, lectures, distance learning, etc. But they must involve interaction with another person, because towards the bottom of 4.3, it says activities that do not qualify: reading financial journals, newspapers, other technical publications, normal work, and activities which do not involve interaction with other individuals. Am I going to be examined on that? You can, but it would only be one question, and it would be with regard to the 5 hours CPT and the activities that are allowed as CPT. 4.4, requirements of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Well, it expects all staff, this is with regard to registered institutions, to be responsible for conducting the regulated activities, and they must meet the SFC requirements as set out in the fit and proper guidelines. And finally, in topic 2, activity reports. We're told under the information rules, SFC may publish details of licensed person and registered institutions and other data. And information maintained in the SFC register will include, and we've listed there, central entity number, etc. I'm not going through that in detail. I've never ever seen it examined. Now, for topic 2, I would say 7 questions could be quite reasonable. It's not complex, and if you've done paper 1, for example, you will have covered a lot of this material before. As I say, it's not difficult, so I would make sure that I have it under my belt. And in doing that, remember, practice questions help. Go to Examinator.online.